The room falls silent. Every eye is on Leonard Whitmore as his hand hovers over the sleek smartphone lying on the mahogany conference table. He's mid-sentence, mid-boast, mid-performance when the device erupts with that unmistakable corporate ringtone. Without hesitation, without even glancing at the screen, Leonard does what he always does. He answers. And then, with the theatrical confidence of a man who believes he owns every room he enters, he taps the speakerphone button. "This is Whitmore," he announces, voice rich with authority. The woman on the other end is polite, professional, measured. "Mr. Whitmore, this is Rachel Mendez from First Continental Bank. I'm calling regarding your business accounts." Leonard grins at the investors across from him, a grin that says, "Watch how effortlessly I handle these things." "Of course, Rachel. What can I do for you?" And then she says it. "Sir, I need to inform you that your primary line of credit has been frozen effective immediately. Multiple payment authorizations were declined this morning, and your main operating account has been temporarily restricted due to delinquency risk protocols." The silence that follows is not empty. It is dense, suffocating, alive with the collective realization that something fundamental has just shattered. Leonard's face doesn't move, but the color drains from it like water from a cracked glass. 3 hours earlier, Leonard Whitmore stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie with the precision of a surgeon. 54 years old, silver at the temples, jaw sharp enough to sell confidence by the pound. He practiced his smile. Not the real one, he hadn't used that in years, but the one that made people believe. The one that said, "I know something you don't, and if you stick with me, you will too." Before we continue with Leonard's story, if you're interested in more stories like this, stories about money, power, and the moments that change everything, make sure to subscribe to Money Stories That Matter. Hit that button right now because we share these narratives every week, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, back to Leonard. Today was important. 2 new investors, serious money, the kind of influx that could either stabilize the precarious tower he'd built or expose it for the house of cards it actually was. He chose not to think about the latter. Leonard Whitmore did not deal in doubt. By 9:15, he was in the executive conference room on the 32nd floor, windows offering a panoramic view of the city sprawling below like a kingdom he'd partially conquered. The room smelled of leather, expensive coffee, and ambition. Sophia Lundgren had already set everything up. She always did. 41, blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, navy suit that whispered competence rather than shouted it. She'd been his financial secretary for 9 years, which meant she knew things. Things Leonard preferred stayed buried in spreadsheets and password-protected folders. She met his eyes briefly as he entered, and he saw it there, that flicker of something he chose to interpret as respect. He didn't realize it was concern, or perhaps warning. "Morning, Sophia. Everything ready?" he asked, not really asking. "Projective set, documents are on the table. Coffee's fresh," she replied, her tone neutral as Switzerland. "Perfect. You're a gem." She didn't smile. She rarely did anymore. The others arrived in a choreographed trickle. First came the board members, Richard and Patricia, both in their 60s, both wearing expressions of cautious optimism. Then the lawyers, silent sentinels with leather portfolios. And finally, the investors, Marcus Chen and Diane Forrester, 30-something venture capitalists with the kind of wealth that didn't need to prove itself, but always did anyway. They shook hands with Leonard, exchanged pleasantries that meant nothing and everything, and took their seats at the table. And then there was Daniel. Daniel Whitmore, 20 years old, economics major at a university his father's money had helped him access, but his own intelligence had helped him navigate. Tall like Leonard, but leaner, softer around the edges in a way that suggested he hadn't yet learned to weaponize charm. Leonard had invited him personally. "You should see how it's done, son. Not from a textbook, from the real world." Daniel had accepted, partly out of curiosity, partly out of that lingering childhood hope that his father might finally let him in. He sat at the far end of the table, notebook open, pen ready, watching. Leonard began the presentation at 9:30 sharp. The projector illuminated a graph that climbed upward like a staircase to heaven. Revenue growth, quarter over quarter, year over year. The numbers were real, technically. They just didn't account for the debt that propped them up like scaffolding on a condemned building. "Gentlemen, lady," Leonard started, gesturing toward the screen with the ease of a conductor leading an orchestra. "What you're seeing here is not luck. It's strategy. It's execution. It's what happens when you refuse to accept mediocrity." Marcus leaned forward, intrigued. Diane made a note on her tablet. Richard nodded slowly.
Patricia sipped her coffee. Daniel watched his father with something between admiration and unease.
We've increased our client base by 38%, Leonard continued, pacing now, owning the space. Our asset management division alone has generated returns that outpace the sector average by double digits. We're not just competing, we're dominating. He paused for effect, let the word hang in the air like incense. And this is just the beginning. Sophia sat near the back of the room, tablet in hand, half listening, half reviewing the actual financials. She knew the presentation by heart. She'd helped prepare it after all, though helped was a generous word. Leonard had dictated what he wanted emphasized. She had complied, as she always did, because jobs like hers weren't easy to come by, and mortgages didn't pay themselves. But she also knew what wasn't on those slides. The overdue vendor invoices, the payroll that had been delayed twice in 3 months, the credit line they'd maxed out and rolled over so many times the interest alone was bleeding them dry. She glanced at Daniel, saw the pride in his eyes, and felt something twist in her chest. He didn't know. Of course he didn't. Leonard would never let him see the cracks. Now, Leonard said, advancing to the next slide, let's talk about liquidity. The word hung there, ironic in hindsight, though no one knew it yet. Our cash position is strong. We've maintained healthy reserves while simultaneously reinvesting in growth. That balance, that discipline, is what separates successful firms from the ones that flame out. Diane looked up. What's your current debt-to-equity ratio? Leonard didn't miss a beat. Well within industry standards. Sophia can provide the exact figures if you'd like. Sophia said nothing. She could provide them. They just wouldn't tell the story Leonard was selling. Marcus raised a hand. And your credit facilities? Are they flexible enough to scale with the growth you're projecting? Absolutely, Leonard replied, smile unwavering. We've cultivated strong relationships with our banking partners. They trust us because we deliver. It was at that exact moment, as if the universe had a sense of theatrical timing, that his phone rang. The device sat on the table in front of him, screen lighting up with the caller ID, First Continental Bank. A lesser man might have hesitated. A wiser man might have silenced it. Leonard Whitmore, convinced of his own infallibility, answered it and put it on speaker. This is Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, this is Rachel Mendez from First Continental Bank. Of course, Rachel, what can I do for you? There was the briefest pause, a half-second gap that should have been a warning. Sir, I need to inform you that your primary line of credit has been frozen effective immediately. Multiple payment authorizations were declined this morning, and your main operating account has been temporarily restricted due to delinquency risk protocols. The words landed like artillery shells. Leonard's smile didn't fade immediately. It lingered, grotesque and disconnected, a mask that hadn't yet realized the face beneath it had changed. I'm sorry, there must be some mistake, he said, voice steady but an octave higher. We've had no issues with our accounts. According to our records, Mr. Whitmore, there have been 3 failed automated payments in the last 2 weeks, and your account balance has fallen below the minimum threshold required by your credit agreement. We attempted to reach you yesterday and this morning. Sophie's eyes closed. She'd known this was coming. She'd sent Leonard 2 emails about it. He hadn't responded. Rachel, I'm in a meeting right now, Leonard said, trying to reclaim control, trying to steer the ship even as water poured through the hull. Can we discuss this later?
I understand, sir, but this is time-sensitive. The freeze will remain in place until we receive payment on the outstanding balance and verify your account status. I've sent the details to your registered email. Right. Yes. I'll handle it. Thank you. He ended the call, thumb stabbing the screen harder than necessary. The room was silent. Not the anticipatory silence of before, but the hollow, ringing silence of a theater after the last patron has left. Marcus and Diane exchanged a glance that communicated volumes. Richard cleared his throat. Patricia set down her coffee cup with a soft clink that sounded like a gavel. Daniel stared at his father, mouth slightly open, pen frozen midair. Leonard laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, performative and desperate. Technical issue, he said, waving a hand dismissively. Banks and their automated systems, always flagging things unnecessarily. Sophia, make a note to call them after this, will you? Sophia nodded slowly, but she didn't write anything down. Diane leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. Mr. Whitmore, with all due respect, that didn't sound like an automated flag. That sounded like a delinquency notice.
It's a miscommunication, Leonard insisted, but his voice had lost its resonance. We have multiple accounts. Sometimes wires get crossed. Marcus stood. I think we need to see your actual financials, not the projections, the current balance sheets, cash flow statements, the full picture. Leonard's jaw tightened. Everything you need is in the prospectus. The prospectus is marketing, Bayan said, standing as well. We need documentation, verified numbers. Richard, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Leonard, if there's a liquidity issue, we need to know, now.
The walls were closing in. Leonard could feel it, the room shrinking, the air thinning. He looked at Sophia, silently pleading for her to rescue him, to produce some magic spreadsheet that would make this all go away. She met his gaze and said, quietly, "The outstanding balance they mentioned is real. We've been operating on extended credit for 5 months." The room exhaled collectively, not in relief, but in resignation. Marcus closed his portfolio. "We're going to need time to reassess." "Reassess?" Leonard's voice cracked. "Based on one phone call?" "Based on a frozen credit line and an admission that you've been hiding financial instability," Diane said, not unkindly, but without sympathy. "We'll be in touch." They left, just like that. 2 investors who had walked in ready to write checks walked out with their checkbooks closed. Richard and Patricia followed, murmuring about emergency board meetings and fiduciary responsibility. The lawyers gathered their things in silence, professionals who'd seen this scene before and would see it again. Within minutes, the room was empty, except for Leonard, Sophia, and Daniel. Leonard stood at the head of the table, hands braced against the wood, breathing like he'd just run a marathon. Sophia began packing up the projector, movements efficient, mechanical. Daniel sat frozen, staring at his notebook where he'd written, in careful handwriting, "Dominating, strong cash position, healthy reserves." The words looked ridiculous now, childish, lies transcribed in blue ink. "Dad?" Daniel's voice was small. Leonard didn't turn around. "Not now." "Dad, what just happened?" "I said not now." The shout echoed in the empty room, harsh and raw. Sophia flinched but didn't stop packing. Daniel stood, chair scraping against the floor. "You told me we were skyrocketing. You said the company was thriving."
Leonard finally turned to face his son. His face was red, veins visible at his temples, eyes wet with something that might have been rage or shame, or both. "You don't understand how business works. It's complicated." "It didn't sound complicated," Daniel said, voice shaking. "It sounded like we're broke." "We are not broke," Leonard slammed his hand on the table. "We're going through a rough patch. Every company does. This is temporary." Sophia zipped the projector case and headed for the door. "Sophia," Leonard called after her. She stopped, turned. "Do you have something to say?" he demanded. She looked at him for a long moment. This man she'd worked for, covered for, enabled for 9 years. "I have the number for a restructuring consultant," she said quietly. "I'll email it to you." She left. Leonard and Daniel stood alone in the vast conference room with its panoramic view and its empty chairs and its lingering smell of expensive coffee gone cold. "I wanted you to see how it's done," Leonard said, voice hollow. "How leadership works." Daniel picked up his notebook, held it like evidence. "Is any of this true? Any of what you showed them?" Leonard wanted to say yes. He wanted to explain that the graphs were accurate, that the growth was real, that he'd simply leveraged aggressively, that this was all just a timing issue, a temporary setback, a bump on an otherwise triumphant road. But standing there, facing his son, the words wouldn't come. Because the truth was more complicated and more simple than that. The truth was that Leonard Whitmore had spent so long performing success that he'd stopped building it. He'd mistaken applause for achievement, admiration for accomplishment. He'd believed his own pitch. "Go home, Daniel," he said finally. "Dad, go home."
Daniel left, and Leonard was alone. He walked to the window, looked out at the city below, all those buildings full of people, pretending, performing, pushing forward. He wondered how many of them were one phone call away from their own speakerphone confessing. His phone buzzed. An email from the bank. Subject line, immediate action required. He didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, he stood there, 54 years old, master of nothing, and let himself feel the full weight of what he'd built. Not an empire, a facade. And facades, no matter how impressive, don't withstand scrutiny. The news spread quickly. By evening, the financial blogs had picked it up. Whitmore Capital faces liquidity crisis. By the next morning, 3 more creditors had called. By the end of the week, the board had voted to bring in external management. Leonard was offered a consulting role, a polite euphemism for forced retirement. He declined. Pride, even in ruin, was hard to relinquish. Daniel didn't come home that night, or the next. He stayed with a friend, needed space, needed time to reconcile the father he'd admired with the man he'd seen unravel in real time. When they finally spoke, 2 weeks later, it was brief and stilted. "I'm sorry you had to see that," Leonard said. "I'm sorry it happened," Daniel replied. They both knew they were talking about different things.
Leonard moved to a smaller office, sold the luxury car, downsized the house. He told people he was streamlining, refocusing, pursuing new opportunities. Some believed him. Most didn't. He started seeing a therapist, not because he wanted to, but because his doctor insisted after his blood pressure spiked dangerously high. In one session, the therapist asked him, "When did you start believing the performance was the reality?" Leonard didn't have an answer, or rather he had too many. The conference room on the 32nd floor was eventually remodeled. New table, new chairs, new energy. A different company moved in, full of different people with different dreams and perhaps different illusions. The view remained the same. Cities don't care about individual failures. They just keep sprawling, indifferent and vast. Months passed. Leonard found himself taking longer walks, spending more time in coffee shops where no one knew his name, where he could sit anonymously and watch people live their lives without the weight of expectation. He started reading again, not business books or market analyses, but novels, stories about other people's failures and redemptions. He discovered he preferred the fiction. It felt more honest somehow. Daniel eventually came back around, not with forgiveness exactly, but with something like understanding. They met for lunch once a month, conversations awkward at first, then gradually less so. They talked about economics, about markets, about theories and models. They didn't talk much about Whitmore Capital. The wound was still too fresh, the scar tissue still forming.
One afternoon, nearly a year after the speakerphone incident, Leonard received a message from Diane Forrester, one of the investors who had walked out of that fateful meeting. She was working with a startup, she said, and they needed someone with experience navigating financial restructuring. Not as CEO, not as the face of anything, but as an advisor, someone who'd been through it and survived. Leonard stared at the message for a long time before responding. He accepted. The work was different, quieter. He sat in smaller rooms with younger entrepreneurs who looked at him not with admiration, but with cautious curiosity. He told them what he knew, what he'd learned, what he wished he'd done differently. He didn't perform, he didn't boast, he just talked, and sometimes they listened. Sophia ran into him at a conference 6 months later. They exchanged pleasantries, professional and cordial. She asked how he was doing. "Better," he said, and meant it. She nodded, seemed to believe him. They parted ways, 2 people who'd shared a catastrophe and survived it in their own ways. The Whitmore name faded from the financial headlines. Other scandals, other collapses, other speakerphone confessions took its place. The cycle continued, relentless and predictable. Somewhere, another Leonard was standing in front of a mirror, adjusting his tie, practicing his smile, preparing to present a version of reality that couldn't withstand a single phone call. But this Leonard, the one sitting in a modest office helping a 25-year-old founder understand cash flow management, wasn't that person anymore. He'd been humbled, not by choice, but by consequence. The fall had been public and painful, but it had also been clarifying. He'd lost the empire, the applause, the illusion of control. What remained was smaller, but more solid. A life built not on performance, but by presence. It wasn't the life he'd imagined at 54. It was, however, the life he'd earned.
Daniel graduated with honors. Leonard attended the ceremony, sat in the back, clapped when his son's name was called. Afterward, they had dinner, just the 2 of them. Daniel talked about job offers, career paths, the future. Leonard listened, offered thoughts when asked, stayed quiet when not. At the end of the meal, Daniel said, "Thanks for coming." Leonard nodded. Wouldn't have missed it. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't redemption. It was just a moment, one of many that would slowly, painstakingly rebuild what the speakerphone had destroyed. Relationships, like finances, operate on trust, and trust, once shattered, requires more than words to restore. It requires time, consistency, and the willingness to be something other than impressive. Years later, when people asked Leonard about Whitmore Capital, he'd give them the short version. "It didn't work out," he'd say, voice even, face calm. Some would press for details, most wouldn't. The story had already been told, picked apart, analyzed, and filed away. Leonard had become a cautionary tale, a data point in someone else's presentation about risk management and due diligence. He was okay with that. Because the truth he'd learned, the one that came too late to save his company, but just in time to save himself, was simple. The story you tell matters less than the story that's true. And sometimes the best thing that can happen to a man built on illusions is for them to shatter completely. What grows in the ruins might be smaller, might be humbler, might not make headlines or inspire TED Talks, but it's real. And real, Leonard discovered, was enough. So what happened to Leonard Whitmore after that phone call, after the investors left, after the empire crumbled? He survived. Not triumphantly, not dramatically, but genuinely. He became a man who could look at himself in the mirror without rehearsing. And in a world obsessed with performance, that might be the rarest success of all.
If you found this story compelling, drop a comment below. Have you ever witnessed a moment like this? A single call, a single revelation that changed everything? Share your thoughts. This is Money Stories That Matter, and we're building a community of people who understand that behind every number, every deal, every success and failure, there's a human story worth examining. Thanks for being here.